After 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen every kind of attitude walk through the doors of my courtroom. I've seen anger, I've seen fear, I've seen people crumble over a $50 fine. But the morning she laughed at a $500 penalty like it was pocket change, something inside me shifted. I didn't know it yet, but that laugh was going to unravel a story far bigger than a simple traffic violation. And when I finally looked past the surface and saw what was really sitting in front of me, even I had to pause. But before I tell you how that day unfolded, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone laugh at something serious, like the rules just didn't apply to them? Think about that for a moment. And if you believe respect still matters in this world, I'd appreciate it if you stayed with me for this story. I've been a judge in Providence for 4 decades. Every morning I get to the courthouse at 8:15 sharp. I don't rush. I've never believed in rushing into a day where people's lives are about to be affected. Christina, my clerk, always has my coffee waiting, strong, black. She knows I won't touch it if there's cream in it. I've had it the same way since 1984. I sit at my desk for a few quiet minutes before court starts. I look over the docket. I remind myself of something my father used to tell me when I was a boy growing up in Providence. He immigrated from Italy with nothing but hope and a work ethic. He'd say, "Frank, treat everyone the same. The rich man puts his pants on the same way as the poor man." I've carried those words with me every single day on that bench. That particular Wednesday in March felt ordinary at first. The air was still cold outside. I remember rubbing my hands together before taking my seat. I could hear the low murmur of people waiting in the gallery. Some nervous, some annoyed, some just wanting it over with. The first few cases that morning were typical. Parking violations, expired registrations, a young man who couldn't afford his inspection sticker. I listened, I asked questions, I reduced fines where I could. I dismissed a case for an elderly gentleman who clearly made an honest mistake. When I said, "Case dismissed," I saw relief wash over his face. Moments like that remind me why I still wear the robe. Then I noticed her. I didn't call her name yet, I just noticed her sitting in the 3rd row. Perfect posture, designer handbag placed carefully beside her. Sunglasses perched on her head even though we were indoors. She wasn't nervous like most people. She looked bored. I remember thinking to myself, that's unusual. When I called the next defendant, a nurse named Mrs. Santos stepped forward. She worked double shifts, she told me, and she had gotten a parking ticket outside the hospital after rushing in during an emergency. I listened carefully. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. I could see it in the way her shoulders sagged. As I reviewed her record, I realized she had never had a violation before. Not one. I leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Santos, I understand what it means to show up when people need you. I'm going to dismiss this." Her eyes filled with tears. She thanked me 3 times before walking away. That's when I heard it. A laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. The kind of laugh that cuts through a quiet room. I lifted my eyes and saw her, the woman with the designer handbag. She was leaning toward the man beside her, whispering something with a smirk. Something about that didn't sit right with me. I called the next case, Mrs. Eleanor Montgomery. She stood up slowly, confident, almost casual. She walked to the front like she was stepping onto a stage she owned. I watched her closely as she approached. She didn't look at me right away. She adjusted her bracelet first. Then she looked up. "Good morning," I said. She gave me a quick nod. "Morning." I glanced at the file. Speeding violation, 20 miles over the limit. Fine amount, $500. I said calmly, "Mrs. Montgomery, you were clocked at 75 in a 55 zone. That's a serious offense. The fine is $500. She laughed. Not nervous laughter, not embarrassed laughter. It was dismissive, like I had just told her the price of a cup of coffee. I felt my jaw tighten slightly. I've learned over the years not to react too quickly. I kept my voice steady. "Is something amusing, ma'am?" She shook her head and waved her hand lightly. No, Your Honor, it's just $500? I heard a few murmurs in the gallery. I leaned forward. Yes, $500, that's the standard fine. She tilted her head. I spend more than that on brunch in a week. There it was, the tone, the entitlement. I could almost feel the temperature in the room change. I saw Christina glance at me from the side of the courtroom. She knows that look I get when I'm trying very hard to stay patient. I said, Mrs. Montgomery, the amount of the fine isn't meant to impress you. It's meant to remind you that speeding endangers lives. She sighed, actually sighed. Then she glanced at her watch. I remember thinking, this isn't about money to her. This is about something else. I asked her, do you understand why speed limits exist? She shrugged. To generate revenue? A few people in the gallery gasped quietly. I felt my blood pressure rising, but I kept my composure. I've been married for 48 years. If there's one thing I've learned, it's how to take a breath before responding. I said, no, ma'am, they exist to protect people like Mrs. Santos, the nurse you just laughed at. Her smile faded for a split second, then it came back. I wasn't laughing at her, she said quickly. I was laughing at the system. I removed my glasses and rubbed the bridge of my nose. In 40 years, I've heard just about every excuse, but something about her confidence felt different. It felt rehearsed. I looked back down at the file. That's when I noticed something small, a notation clipped to the back. It wasn't part of the standard traffic paperwork. It was a supplemental document. My gut told me to pay attention. I flipped the page slowly. I didn't react. I've learned never to show surprise too early, but I could feel a shift in my chest. Something wasn't adding up. I looked back at her. She was scrolling on her phone now, in my courtroom. I said firmly, Mrs. Montgomery, put the phone away. She looked up, mildly annoyed, and slid it into her purse. I leaned back in my chair and studied her for a moment. I've learned that sometimes the smallest cases reveal the biggest truths, and sometimes the people who laugh the loudest are hiding something deeper. I tapped the edge of the file lightly with my finger. Mrs. Montgomery, I said slowly, is there anything else you'd like to tell me before I finalize this? She crossed her arms. No, Your Honor, I'll pay it. It's not a big deal. I held her gaze. In that moment, I felt something I haven't felt often on that bench. Not anger, not frustration, curiosity. Because something in that file was telling me this wasn't just about a speeding ticket. And I've learned one thing in 40 years. When your instincts tell you to look twice, you look twice. I glanced at Christina. She gave me the smallest nod. She had seen the notation too. I closed the folder halfway. Mrs. Montgomery, I said, my voice calm but deliberate. Before we move forward, I'm going to review something attached to your file. For the first time, her confidence flickered. Just a little, and that's when I realized this $500 fine might be the least of her concerns. I kept my hand on that file for a moment longer than usual. I've learned that silence can say more than a raised voice ever could. The courtroom was quiet now. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. I could feel people leaning forward, waiting to see what I was going to do. I opened the folder fully this time. Mrs. Montgomery, I said evenly, how long have you lived in Providence? She blinked, clearly not expecting that question. About 3 years, I nodded. And before that? New York. Her tone was clipped, short, controlled. I could tell she didn't like being asked anything outside the script she had prepared in her head. I glanced down again at the supplemental document. It wasn't detailed, just a reference, a flag, a note from another jurisdiction requesting notification if she appeared in court. That's not normal for a speeding ticket. I looked back at her. Are you aware of any pending matters outside of this traffic violation? She stiffened slightly. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't notice it. But after 40 years of watching faces from this bench, I notice everything. The smallest change in breathing, the quick swallow, the flicker in the eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said. Her voice was still confident, but the warmth was gone. It was sharper now. I leaned forward. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm going to ask you again. Is there anything else currently under review in your name?" She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her hand moved instinctively toward her handbag, then stopped. "I handle my own affairs," she said. "If there were something important, I'd know." That sentence stayed with me. If there were something important, I remember thinking, sometimes the most important things are the ones people pretend not to see. I picked up my glasses and placed them back on. I read the notation more carefully. It referenced a financial crimes division. No details, just a contact line and a case number. That's when I felt that quiet sensation in my gut again, the one that saved me from making quick decisions more times than I can count. I said calmly, "Christina, would you please contact the clerk's office listed on this notation?" Christina nodded and stepped quietly out of the courtroom. Mrs. Montgomery let out a small, impatient breath. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is ridiculous. It's a traffic fine." I looked directly at her. "Ma'am, what's ridiculous is driving 20 miles over the speed limit and laughing about it." Her jaw tightened. "I wasn't laughing at you," she said. "I know," I replied gently. "You were laughing at the consequences." The room was still. I could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead. She crossed her arms again. $500 is not a consequence to me." I nodded slowly. "That may be true, but consequences aren't measured by what they cost you. They're measured by what they protect." I saw a few heads in the gallery nod slightly. People feel it when someone dismisses responsibility. They might not say it, but they feel it. I thought about my father again. He used to say, "Frank, character shows when no one thinks it matters." I've repeated that line to myself thousands of times on this bench. Mrs. Montgomery looked around the courtroom, almost as if she was embarrassed to still be standing there. I could see her calculating, wondering how long this would take, wondering who might see her. I asked her, "Do you work here in Providence?" She hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. "I'm involved in several charitable organizations." Charitable organizations. The words hung in the air. "I see," I said. I remembered the nurse from earlier, Mrs. Santos, the way her hands trembled slightly when she explained her situation. That woman worked 12-hour shifts caring for strangers. And here stood someone who described herself as charitable while treating the courtroom like an inconvenience. I'm not quick to judge people. I've learned that appearances lie, but behavior rarely does. Christina re-entered the courtroom quietly. She walked up to the bench and handed me a small slip of paper. I read it carefully. Then I felt something shift inside me. The notation wasn't just a flag. It was an active request for immediate judicial notification upon contact. The Financial Crimes Division in New York had an open inquiry tied directly to her name, and not a small one. I set the paper down slowly. "Mrs. Montgomery," I said, keeping my voice steady, "are you currently serving as a board member for the Haven Children's Medical Foundation?" For the first time since she stepped forward, her composure cracked. "How do you know that?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. I've learned that when someone asks a question like that, they already know the answer. I said, "Oi, please answer mine first." "Yes," she replied quietly. "I am." I nodded once. "And how long have you held that position?" "About 2 years." The air in the room felt heavier now. I could sense people listening more closely. They didn't know why yet, but they knew something had changed. I folded my hands together on the bench. "Mrs. Montgomery," I said carefully, "the reason I'm asking is because the Financial Crimes Division in New York has placed a hold notification tied to your involvement with that foundation." Her face went pale. "That's impossible," she said quickly. "There must be a mistake." I watched her closely. I've seen guilt. I've seen innocence. And I've seen confusion. What I saw in her eyes wasn't confusion. It was fear. She shook her head. I'm not responsible for any financial decisions. I just attend events. I leaned forward slightly. Events funded by donations intended for sick children. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I don't manage the accounts, she insisted. My husband handles that side of things. There it was. A new name introduced without me asking. I've learned something else over 40 years. When someone redirects responsibility that quickly, they've rehearsed it. I said calmly, Mrs. Montgomery, at this moment, I'm not making any accusations. I'm verifying information, but understand this. When your name is attached to a charitable foundation, you carry responsibility, whether you manage the books or not. Her hands were shaking now, just slightly, the same hands that had waved off a $500 fine like it was pocket change. I thought about Mrs. Santos again. I thought about the hospital she worked in. I thought about the families who rely on foundations like that one. I removed my glasses once more and placed them gently on the bench. I need you to listen carefully, I said, because this is no longer just about speeding. The confidence was gone from her posture. Her shoulders were no longer squared, her eyes no longer bored. For the first time, she looked small, and as I looked down at the file again, I realized something I hadn't expected when I walked into court that morning. That laugh wasn't just arrogance. It was the sound of someone who believed the surface would never crack, but surfaces always crack. And what was underneath was beginning to show. I've seen that look before. It's the moment when someone realizes the room has shifted, but they don't yet know how far it's going to move beneath their feet. Mrs. Montgomery was still standing there, but the air around her had changed. The confidence that carried her to the front of my courtroom was thinning, like fog lifting under a hard sun. I kept my voice calm. I've learned that when emotions rise, the judge has to lower his. Mrs. Montgomery, I said gently, I need you to understand that I don't deal in rumors. I deal in facts. And right now, the only fact I have is that another jurisdiction has flagged your name in connection with a financial inquiry. She swallowed. I saw her throat tighten. Your Honor, I attend charity galas. I host events. I don't handle money. I nodded slowly. That may be, but your name appears on incorporation documents as a co-signing officer. Her eyes widened just slightly, not dramatically, just enough. In 40 years, I've learned that the smallest reactions tell the biggest stories. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. Let me ask you something simple. When you sign your name to something, do you read it? The courtroom was silent. She hesitated. Of course. I tilted my head. Every time? That question hung there between us. She didn't answer. I glanced toward Christina, who was standing near the clerk's desk. She gave me a look that told me she was thinking the same thing I was. Something bigger was moving behind this simple speeding case. I said, Mrs. Montgomery, the Haven Children's Medical Foundation, how much money did it raise last year? Her lips parted, then closed. I don't know the exact number. Was it in the millions? She looked down. I'm not asking to embarrass you, I continued. I'm asking because when you attach your name to a foundation serving sick children, that name carries weight. She shifted again, and this time it wasn't subtle. She was uncomfortable now. Her hand tightened around the strap of her handbag. I trusted the people around me, she said quietly. I heard that sentence clearly. I trusted the people around me. I've heard that before too. I leaned forward slightly. Trust is not a defense against responsibility. A few people in the gallery nodded. I could feel the temperature in the room drop. Not physically, emotionally. I opened the supplemental document again and read more carefully. There was a summary note from New York. preliminary findings, missing funds, discrepancies between donations reported and hospital transfers documented. I paused. Time seemed to slow down. I remember thinking to myself, if even half of this is accurate, this is no small matter. I looked back up at her. Mrs. Montgomery, are you aware of any discrepancies in the Foundation's financial reporting? Her voice was thinner now. No. Have you been contacted by investigators? She hesitated again, just long enough. Yes, she admitted. They asked a few questions. When? Last month. And you didn't think that was important? She didn't answer. I took a deep breath. I've learned that frustration doesn't help anyone. Clarity does. Let me explain something, I said carefully. In my courtroom, I see people every day who struggle to pay $50 fines. I saw a nurse this morning who works double shifts to care for patients, and now I'm looking at documentation suggesting that money donated for sick children may not have reached its destination. Her head snapped up. I would never steal from children. I held her gaze. I didn't say you did. Silence again. But your name is attached, I continued, and that matters. I could see it now. The unraveling wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was internal. Her posture had collapsed slightly. Her voice no longer carried that sharp edge of dismissal. I asked her, "Where is your husband today?" "He's traveling," she said quickly. "For business?" "Yes," I nodded once. "Is he the primary financial officer of the foundation?" "Yes." "Does he control the accounts?" "Yes." "And you co-sign?" She hesitated. "Yes." There it was. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. I've learned that sometimes people believe proximity to power shields them from consequence. They stand close enough to feel protected, but far enough to claim ignorance. I said softly, "Mrs. Montgomery, ignorance is not insulation." Her eyes filled slightly, just barely, but I saw it. She looked different now than the woman who laughed at a $500 fine. I closed the file halfway and rested my hands on top of it. "I need to ask you something directly," I said. "Did you ever question why the reported fundraising totals were higher than the hospital transfer confirmations?" She blinked rapidly. I don't handle the transfers." "That wasn't my question." She shook her head slowly. I leaned back again and removed my glasses. I placed them carefully on the bench. "I've been on this bench for 40 years, I said quietly, "and I've learned one thing above all else. Money can complicate things, but it doesn't erase responsibility." The courtroom was still as stone. "Right now," I continued, "this traffic violation is the smallest concern in this room." She whispered, "What happens now?" That question wasn't defiant. It wasn't sarcastic. It was afraid. I looked at Christina. She had already contacted the number listed in the notation. She gave me a subtle nod. I felt that familiar sensation in my gut again, the one that tells me a moment is bigger than it first appeared. "Mrs. Montgomery," I said slowly, "the Financial Crimes Division has requested immediate notification if you appeared in any court proceeding." Her face drained of color. "They're on their way," I added quietly. A soft gasp moved through the gallery. She grabbed the edge of the podium. "On their way? Here?" "Yes." "This is insane," she said, her voice shaking now. "I didn't do anything." I watched her carefully. "I hope that's true," I said, "for everyone's sake." Time seemed to stretch in that room. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock behind me. Every second felt louder. The woman who had laughed at a $500 fine was no longer smirking. She wasn't checking her watch. She wasn't glancing at her phone. She was standing very still, and as I sat there waiting, I couldn't help but think about something my father once told me. He said, "Frank, a person shows you who they are in the small moments. Pay attention to those." That laugh had been a small moment, but it opened a door to something much larger. And as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway outside my courtroom, I realized this day was about to become one I would never forget. I've heard many sounds in my courtroom over the years: nervous coughing, angry whispers, even applause that I had to quickly silence. But that morning, the sound that reached my ears was different. It was steady, deliberate, the echo of firm footsteps moving down the hallway toward my courtroom doors. I didn't rush. I've learned never to rush a moment like that. Mrs. Montgomery heard it too. I saw her head turn slightly toward the entrance. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the podium. The woman who had laughed minutes earlier now looked like she was trying to steady herself against invisible wind. The doors opened. 2 individuals stepped inside. They weren't loud. They didn't announce themselves dramatically. They didn't need to. Their presence carried its own weight. Dark suits, measured expressions. One of them made brief eye contact with Christina before approaching the bench. I felt the entire courtroom stiffen. The man in front spoke calmly. "Your Honor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Reeves. We were notified." I nodded. "Thank you for coming." Mrs. Montgomery's breathing had changed. It was shallow now, controlled, but barely. I said quietly, "Mrs. Montgomery, please remain where you are." She looked at me as if hoping I would suddenly wave this away, as if I would tell her it was all a misunderstanding and dismiss everyone. But the law doesn't bend because someone expects it to. Mr. Reeves handed Christina a sealed envelope. She brought it to me. I opened it carefully. I've opened thousands of documents on that bench, some small, some life-altering. This one felt heavy before I even read it. I scanned the first page. Then I slowed down. I've learned to read carefully when people's futures are written in ink. The charges were no longer preliminary inquiries. They were formal filings: wire fraud, interstate financial misrepresentation, conspiracy to divert charitable funds. The foundation had raised over $12 million in the past 2 years. Nearly $4 million of that had never reached the children's hospital it claimed to support. I felt something deep in my chest. $4 million. That's not an accounting error. I looked up at her. She was staring at me now, her eyes wide, searching my face for some sign of mercy. I spoke carefully, because words matter in moments like this. "Mrs. Montgomery, according to these filings, funds donated to the Haven Children's Medical Foundation were diverted into shell accounts controlled by your household." She shook her head violently. No, that's not true." I continued reading. "Transfers were authorized with your electronic signature." Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. I watched the room absorb it. People who had come in for minor infractions were now witnessing something far larger. A foundation for sick children, millions missing. I remembered Mrs. Santos. I remembered the fatigue in her eyes. The long hours she worked caring for patients who depended on that very hospital. I felt my jaw tighten again, but I kept my tone steady. "Mrs. Montgomery, do you deny authorizing these transfers?" "I didn't know what they were," she said quickly. "My husband handles investments. He told me it was restructuring." "Restructuring," I repeated softly. She nodded rapidly. "Yes, tax positioning. He said it was temporary." I paused. I've learned something about temporary explanations. They often become permanent consequences. Mr. Reeves stepped forward slightly. "Your Honor, the investigation indicates that funds were routed through 3 separate LLCs registered under her name." She turned toward him. "I never set up any LLCs." He held her gaze calmly. "They were registered with your digital credentials." Her knees seemed to weaken slightly. She grabbed the podium harder. "I don't understand," she whispered. I looked directly at her. "Mrs. Montgomery, earlier this morning, you told me $500 was insignificant to you." She closed her eyes briefly. I saw tears forming in her eyes. Mr. Reeves spoke again. "Your Honor, we are prepared to take her into custody pending transfer." There it was, the line no one wants to hear. I took a slow breath. In 40 years, I've had moments where justice felt abstract, complicated. But this wasn't abstract. This was real money, meant for real children, allegedly redirected into private accounts. I looked at her one more time. Mrs. Montgomery, you are entitled to counsel. You are entitled to defend yourself. But at this moment, these charges are no longer theoretical. She looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. What about my husband? She asked faintly. Mr. Reeves answered calmly. He is being processed separately. Her hand flew to her mouth, and in that instant I saw something new. Not arrogance, not entitlement, fear, real fear. I had to pause, not because I doubted the charges, but because I felt the weight of how quickly a life can change. Just an hour earlier, she had laughed at $500. Now she was facing federal charges tied to millions. I thought about something my father once told me when I first became a judge. He said, Frank, never enjoy someone's downfall. Your job is justice, not satisfaction. I've carried that advice with me every day. So I didn't gloat, I didn't lecture. I simply said, Mrs. Montgomery, please step back from the podium. The agents moved forward, and as they did, I realized something that still stays with me. The loudest sound in the courtroom that morning wasn't her laugh. It was the silence that followed when the truth was finally read aloud. I've watched hundreds of people walk away from that podium over the years. Some leave relieved, some angry, some ashamed. But that morning, when Mrs. Montgomery stepped back as the agents approached, I saw something I don't think she had ever experienced before. She felt small. The confidence that had filled the room when she first stood in front of me was gone. Her shoulders were no longer squared. Her chin wasn't lifted. She looked around the courtroom as if searching for something familiar, something stable. But there was nothing for her to grab onto anymore. The first agent spoke quietly. Ma'am, please turn around. She didn't move at first. I've seen that hesitation before. It's the space between denial and reality. The last second where a person hopes someone will interrupt and say there's been a mistake. But no one spoke. I felt the weight of the moment settle over the entire room. People who had been whispering earlier were now completely silent. Even the air felt heavy. Mrs. Montgomery, I said gently, you need to comply. She slowly turned around. I heard the faint click of metal. I will never forget that sound. Handcuffs don't clang loudly the way people think they do. They close with a small final snap, quiet, certain. There's something about that sound that cuts through a room sharper than any shout. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and fell to the floor. No one picked it up. The woman who had dismissed $500 as trivial now stood in front of everyone restrained by steel. I felt no triumph. I felt no anger. I felt something else entirely. Gravity. That's the only word I can use. The gravity of how quickly life can tilt. She looked over her shoulder at me, tears now fully visible in her eyes. Your Honor, she said softly, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I held her gaze. I believe that many people don't mean for things to happen, I said calmly. But intent doesn't erase impact. Her breathing was uneven now. The same woman who had smirked about brunch bills was struggling to catch her breath. I thought about the children whose names were probably listed in hospital records. The families who donated believing their money would help. I thought about Mrs. Santos working double shifts. I felt my throat tighten slightly, but I kept my composure. The agents began guiding her toward the aisle. Everything seemed to move slowly. Time does that in moments like this. It stretches. It makes every footstep louder. As she walked past the third row where she had been sitting earlier, I remembered her laugh, that sharp, dismissive sound that had cut through the courtroom. It felt like it had happened hours ago, not minutes. And I remember thinking to myself, this is why humility matters. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. I've learned that a judge must remain steady even when the room feels shaken. Before she reached the door, she stopped. Your Honor, she said again, turning slightly despite the agent's grip. I trusted him. I didn't check. I just signed what he put in front of me. There it was. I trusted him. I didn't check. I signed. 3 sentences that carry enormous weight. I looked at her carefully. For the first time that morning, I saw no arrogance at all, just fear and regret. I've learned one thing in 40 years, I said quietly. When you sign your name, you sign your responsibility. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I never thought it would come to this, she whispered. I nodded slightly. Most people don't. The agents resumed guiding her forward. The courtroom doors opened once more, and she disappeared into the hallway. The silence that followed was unlike anything I've felt in a long time. No one moved. I looked down at the file still resting on my bench. $500. That's how the morning started. I tapped the gavel lightly, not to command order, but to break the stillness. Court will take a brief recess, I announced. People slowly began to stand. Conversations started in hushed tones. Shock has a way of softening voices. I stepped back into my chambers. When the door closed behind me, I removed my glasses and set them on my desk. I stood there for a moment, just breathing. After 40 years, you'd think moments like that would get easier. They don't. I walked over to the small window in my chambers and looked out at the street below. Cars moving, people walking, life continuing as if nothing had just shifted inside my courtroom. I thought about how quickly entitlement can dissolve, how fragile power really is. I also thought about something else. Complicity. It's a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It doesn't boast. It simply agrees. It signs. It assumes someone else is responsible. And sometimes that quiet agreement causes more damage than loud arrogance ever could. There was a soft knock on my door. Come in, I said. Christina stepped inside. She closed the door gently behind her. Are you all right? She asked. I nodded slowly. I am. She hesitated. $4 million, she said quietly. I nodded again. For sick kids, she added. I sat down in my chair. I've presided over murder cases, I said softly, but there's something uniquely painful about stealing hope. Christina didn't respond. She didn't need to. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. I remembered my grandson's 12th birthday last week. The way he smiled when he blew out the candles. The way children trust the world to protect them. Then I thought about hospital rooms, IV poles, parents sitting beside beds. I opened my eyes. I told her earlier, I said almost to myself, that money can't buy character. Christina gave a small nod. And I meant it. There was a pause. Do you think she knew? Christina asked carefully. I didn't answer right away. I think, I said slowly, that sometimes people convince themselves not to know. That's the most dangerous kind of ignorance. Christina stepped closer to the desk. You handled it well. I shook my head slightly. It's not about handling it well. It's about making sure justice stays steady. She gave me a small smile and left the room. I sat there alone for another minute. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt reminded that respect isn't optional, responsibility isn't decorative, and signatures are never just ink on paper. After a few moments, I stood up, straightened my robe, and returned to the courtroom. The next case was already waiting, because justice doesn't pause for shock. It continues. And as I resumed my seat on that bench, I realized something that stayed with me long after that day ended. The loudest fall isn't the one everyone hears. It's the one a person feels inside when they realize the ground they were standing on was never solid to begin with. Court resumed that morning, and I did what I've done every day for 40 years. I listened, I asked questions, I made rulings. On the surface, everything looked normal again, but inside I kept thinking about her. Not the woman who laughed, the woman who turned around in handcuffs and said, "I trusted him." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. By the time I got home that evening, my wife could tell it had been a heavy day. After 48 years of marriage, she reads my face better than anyone. I hung my robe carefully in the closet, loosened my tie, and sat down at the kitchen table. She placed a cup of tea in front of me. "Tough one?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Children's hospital funds," I said quietly. She didn't need more explanation. She just reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I've learned that being a judge doesn't make you immune to feeling. If anything, it sharpens it. You see the best and worst of people in a single morning. That night I couldn't sleep easily. I kept replaying the day in my mind, the laugh, the shift in her eyes, the sound of the cuffs, and I kept asking myself something I always ask after a case like that. At what moment did it begin? Because these stories don't start with federal agents walking through courtroom doors. They start much earlier, with a decision, a signature, a conversation at a dinner table. 2 months passed. The case moved into the federal system. My role in it ended the moment she left my courtroom. But sometimes cases don't leave your thoughts when they leave your docket. Then one afternoon, Christina knocked on my chamber door, holding a plain white envelope. "It's for you," she said, "from a correctional facility in New York." I looked at the return address. Her name was printed neatly in the corner. I stared at it for a moment before opening it. I've received letters before, some angry, some grateful, some apologetic. But this one felt different before I even unfolded the paper. I sat down at my desk and opened it slowly. Her handwriting was careful, controlled. "Your Honor," it began, "I don't know if you'll read this, but I need to write it." I paused. I've learned that writing forces honesty in a way speaking sometimes doesn't. When you write, there's no audience to impress. She continued. "I keep replaying that morning in my head. I hear myself laugh. I hear the way I sounded. I didn't recognize that woman until it was too late." I leaned back in my chair. She wrote about growing up without wealth, about meeting her husband at a charity gala, about being told she was lucky, about signing documents she barely glanced at because she believed that was what supportive wives did. Then came the line that made me stop reading for a moment. I thought my job was to look the part, smile at events, wear the right dress, trust that the details were handled by people smarter than me. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes. There it was, not arrogance, avoidance. She admitted she saw discrepancies, small ones at first, numbers that didn't quite match, transfers that seemed delayed. But each time she asked, she was reassured. It's temporary, it's strategic, it's legal, and she chose to believe it, not because she understood it, but because it was easier than confronting it. I've seen that pattern before, not always with millions of dollars, sometimes with small lies, small shortcuts, small compromises. They grow quietly. She wrote about the day investigators contacted her. She described the fear, the arguments at home, the moment she realized the accounts were under her name as much as his. And then she wrote something that stayed with me. "When you said $500 wasn't measured by what it cost me, but by what it protected, I finally understood what I had ignored." I read that sentence twice. She ended the letter by saying she had begun cooperating fully with investigators, that she had agreed to testify, that she was trying to help recover as much of the diverted funds as possible. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote, "but I wanted you to know that I understand now." I folded the letter slowly. I sat there in silence for several minutes. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt reflective, because her story wasn't just about greed. It was about identity, about building a life around image instead of integrity. I thought about something my father used to say when I was young. He would tell me, "Frank, the people who scare me aren't the ones who steal loudly. It's the ones who convince themselves they didn't." Self-deception is powerful. I looked out the window of my chambers again, just like I had the day she was taken away. Cars moved, people walked, life continued. I asked myself quietly, could I have seen it sooner? Could I have sensed it before the file crossed my bench? But that's not how justice works. We deal with what's in front of us, when it arrives. I picked up the letter again and read the last paragraph. I don't know who I'll be after this, she wrote, but I know I can't be the woman who laughed. That line lingered, because sometimes the fall is not the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning of clarity. I've always believed something simple. Consequences are not just punishment. They're revelation. They reveal character, or the lack of it. They reveal whether someone doubles down on denial or begins to face truth. I placed the letter in my desk drawer instead of the trash, not because I excused what happened, but because I believe in remembering. Remembering that arrogance can be a mask. Remembering that trust without responsibility is dangerous. And remembering that even people who fall hard can choose what they do next. Later that week, I heard through official channels that a significant portion of the missing funds had been traced and frozen. More would likely be recovered through asset seizures. It wouldn't undo the breach of trust, but it meant something. And as I prepared for court the next morning, sipping my strong black coffee at 8:15 like I always do, I thought about how that day had started with a laugh. It ended with handcuffs. But somewhere in between, it became something else. A lesson. Not just for her. For anyone who believes signing blindly protects them. For anyone who thinks image replaces accountability. And even for me, because after 40 years on this bench, I'm still reminded that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins quietly, with a piece of paper and a signature. A few weeks after I received that letter, something happened that brought the entire story full circle. It was a quiet afternoon. Court had ended for the day, and I was organizing a few papers on my desk when Christina knocked gently on my chamber door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Who is it?" I asked. "She says you'll remember her. Mrs. Santos." I smiled immediately. "Of course I remember her. Please send her in." Mrs. Santos stepped into my chamber slowly, still wearing her nurse's uniform. She looked tired, the way nurses often do at the end of a long shift, but there was something else in her expression this time, something lighter. "Your Honor," she said softly. "Mrs. Santos," I replied warmly. "Please have a seat." She sat down across from me, hands folded neatly in her lap. I could see she was nervous, but not the way she had been in court. This was different. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "For dismissing the ticket," I asked gently. She shook her head. "For what happened after?" I paused. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said carefully. She took a breath. "The hospital sent out a notice last week. The funds that were frozen in that foundation case, some of them have already been redirected to pediatric care. They're reopening a treatment wing that was on hold." I felt something warm rise in my chest. "That's wonderful news," I said. She nodded, eyes glistening slightly. "My daughter, she's been volunteering there on weekends. She wants to be a doctor someday." I leaned forward, listening closely. "They announced something else," she continued, "a scholarship program, funded by the recovered money, for local students going into medical fields." I could already see where this was going. "She applied," Mrs. Santos said, her voice trembling just a little, "and she received the first one." For a moment I couldn't speak. I've sat on that bench for 40 years. I've seen verdicts delivered. I've seen sentences handed down. But very few moments have felt as quietly powerful as that one. "She did?" I asked softly. Mrs. Santos nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Full tuition assistance." I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. You see, justice doesn't always end with handcuffs. Sometimes it continues long after the courtroom empties. I thought about that day again. The laugh, the silence, the sound of cuffs closing, the letter from prison, and now this, a scholarship. A young girl stepping closer to her dream because funds that were almost lost were brought back into the light. I looked at Mrs. Santos and said something I truly meant. I've learned one thing in 40 years. The law doesn't care about your bank account. It cares about your actions. And when the law works the way it's supposed to, it protects the people who need it most. She smiled through her tears. My daughter wanted me to tell you thank you, she said. She said if you hadn't looked twice that morning, things might have stayed hidden longer. I shook my head gently. I didn't do anything extraordinary, I replied. I just paid attention. But the truth is, sometimes paying attention is everything. After she left, I sat alone in my chambers again. I thought about Mrs. Montgomery's letter, about her saying she didn't want to be the woman who laughed. I don't know what her future holds. That's not for me to decide anymore. But I do know this. Consequences don't just punish. They redirect. They correct the path. They remind us that no one stands above the ground we all share. I often think back to my father. He came to this country with nothing but a suitcase and determination. He worked hard. He believed deeply that America worked because the rules applied to everyone, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. He would tell me, Frank, if the law ever bends for the wealthy, it breaks for everyone else. I carry those words with me every time I take my seat. That morning started like any other. Coffee at 8:15, files stacked neatly, minor infractions waiting to be resolved. It ended with federal agents walking through my courtroom doors. But it didn't truly end there. It continued in a hospital wing reopening its doors. It continued in a scholarship awarded to a nurse's daughter. It continued in a letter written from a prison cell where someone finally confronted the sound of her own laughter. And it continues every time I sit on that bench and remind myself that humility is not optional. Money can buy comfort, it can buy influence, it can buy appearances, but it cannot buy exemption. It cannot buy immunity from consequence. And it certainly cannot buy character. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this story with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who believes that character matters more than cash. And check out the next story waiting for you. I've got another case that reminded me why respect and responsibility still matter in this life. I'll see you there. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We are all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.